Hi, I'm Zoe Hawkins and I'm here today with Dr. John Coyne, the head of ASPI's Border Security Program, to talk a little bit about police performance measures. Hi John, thanks for being with us.
Hi Zoe.
So obviously it's been quite an eventful few months. We had Australia's largest drug bust in December in Sydney with the seizure of 500 kilograms of cocaine, and then again in January we saw 300 kilos of pseudoephedrine grabbed in Melbourne. Do you want to talk a little bit about the significance of these events?
Yeah, look, I think we've actually almost got to rewind a little bit. So we had last year and into 2015 as well, we had this really big moral panic across Australia about ICE and its impacts across the community. So we saw the beginning of the ICE task force and people are really concerned. On face value, fast forward, we see these major busts and the general public, and you see a couple of things. So number one is you see these magic press releases for organisations like the Australian Federal Police and the Australian Border Force, and indeed their ministers as well. So when I say magic, it's not meant to be sarcastic, but you see, you know, armed police officers either side, gigantic logos, plastic covered drugs on a table. It has a very dramatic effect for the public, and it sends a really strong, powerful message that, you know, we're doing something about this drug problem. The problem for us, taking it the next step further, is that does it actually mean anything? So we've seen over the last couple of years the price of drugs here are stable, like statistically stable, I mean, in general, they remain very easy to get. So there's a whole heap of really great survey work that's done by a range of different universities, by people who are both recreational and users of drugs and or identify as being drug addicts or addicted to drugs. And by that, I mean illicit substances. And the message is quite clear, you know, that it's not having a marked impact on the community. So we have this sort of disjointness where we've got comfort on one side from these statistics of seizures and, you know, large quantities, and on the other side we have something quite different, which is the realities.
Right, and so in that sense, how do these sort of high-profile seizures fit into what the government is trying to achieve with these law enforcement measures?
Look, where it fits is about going through and doing risk management models for the organisation. Now that might seem a little bit tongue-in-cheek and very, you know, traditionally MBA type speak. But in reality, you are what you measure. Okay, so organisations like the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Border Force, have declining budgets. Now, in real terms, what that means is that they've got less staff to do the jobs that come in. So it's been a case for a number of years. The amount of reported crime far exceeds their capacity to investigate. So both the performance measures for their organisations and this resource sort of squeeze have the impact that let's concentrate only on the big things that are going to seize us more drugs, more money. When I was doing my PhD a number of years ago, it was said really quite clearly, and, you know, I was asking a very senior member of a law enforcement agency about it, and he said to me, he said, John, look, you know, this policing thing at the national level is about banging up crooks and seizing drugs. But when you read the national strategy for illicit drugs, there's this big disjoint. So again, it doesn't say in there seize more drugs, it says reduce the supply of drugs in our community. Now when I sit down, or when we sit down to speak to people within the departments, there's of course a counter argument, which is that if the police weren't seizing this amount of drugs would indeed, there'd be even more drugs on our streets, and they'd be even more cheaper. So, you know, I think that's where you sort of face this really difficult proposition about how you assess and mark this. Now, there's a lot of pressure on police to do this value, high amounts of seizures, you know, the table effect. You know, the minister sitting there going, oh, we've taken $1 million. It's probably worthwhile here also saying that, so when you look at a big drug bust, let's compare it to other things. So there's some great assessment work done on this in the past where when you go to a restaurant and you buy a steak, so buy the best possible steak in the world, you might pay $100 US for this steak in the streets of Washington. But that doesn't mean that when you calculate how much a cow is worth sitting in a paddock, that it's, you know, $100 a kilo or $100 a steak. In fact, you know, along the way, it gains value, and some parts of the cow gains value or the meat gains value, while other parts don't. What we see with drugs, though, is when we assess it, We turn around and say, we've seized $500 million worth of drugs. In reality, that is the street price with individual sales, but that's not what we're taking off the organised crime syndicates. And the challenging part of it is a lot of these syndicates, the people who are actually responsible for these large seizures, we're not having a net impact on their business model. What they do is wire those seizures in as a cost of doing business. So, if you have a successful venture, you'll have others that are unsuccessful. My point here is that how we assess and shape this argument around drug seizures is a little less black line and clear than what is being portrayed.
Right, and so in that sense we could think about these high-profile seizures being maybe more for that public interest and that narrative around the work they're doing, rather than maybe are we seeing that impact on the ground in terms of success for challenges like the ice epidemic. You mentioned that the prices are stable. Is that?
Well, we have an impact on the price. So again, it's those two arguments. On one side, some in law enforcement would say to you, well, if all those drugs got through, the prices would be even lower, we'd have more people addicted, etc. I'm less convinced about that, and this is where I think it's not a either or argument. I think that we need to have law enforcement agencies need a great deal more freedom to look at these drug supply issues and concentrate a little less on seizing large quantities of drugs and a little more on reducing the actual supply. And we've seen that quite successfully. So take, the Royal Thai family eradicated the production of opium in the Golden Triangle on the Thai side of the border, not by arresting citizens, but by doing a range of activities. So there was some policing work, there was crop replacements and investments. So all of a sudden you saw the royal family assisting people who traditionally grow opium to grow flowers for international and domestic markets, to grow tea and export tea. Now today we would go to Chiang Mai or Chiang Rai in the north of Thailand, and we would be able to go see, and we'd actually go buy some really great tea, but we would see these sorts of things in action. You would find it very difficult, as does law enforcement there, to find opium growing. Now, that's a sort of a prime example of the thing we're talking about here, which is, it's important the public want to see large seizures, and it gives us a sense of well-being, but this other stuff needs to be done as well. Yeah,
so if we're seeing the seizures and these arrests, but we're not seeing changes on the ground, are there different measures of, law enforcement performance that we should be looking at?
Look, I think there are, and this is where it gets very difficult. There's some agencies that this has been tried, so there's this classic cartoon about 5-6 years ago in the UK, in a UK newspaper, where someone had actually scored or at a street level cocaine, and the drug that they purchased was actually cocaine. So at the time, the Serious and Organised Crime Agency in the UK, through concerted efforts, had been able to disrupt the supply of cocaine to the UK to such an extent that it was near on impossible to buy cocaine in the UK. So yeah, you can have those sorts of impacts. It's just about targeting your effort. It can't be a blind pursuit of just seizures, and we've seen that. Okay, so even in the ICE task force, we heard a number of very specific quotes going, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. Yet we're still measuring how we're getting out of this problem by what we see. So I think the things like pricing and availability. So there's a lot of statistics out there around pricing, and we could use that. It's a much more for the police and border agencies. It's a really difficult proposition. Can you imagine if you had to, your measure of success was to drive the price of ice deals on the streets up by 10%? But it's probably also important to note, even those sorts of measures, none of them are absolutely complete. So there's an assumption there that if you drive the price of drugs up by 10%, for instance, or increase it, that like cigarettes, people will stop using them. For some types of drugs, that may not be the case. And then we have those sort of social, challenges where, for instance, if you're, and we've seen this a lot, which is for a young person to go on a night on the town in Sydney or Melbourne, it's going to cost them, $100 or a couple of $100 to drink alcohol in a nightclub, taxis, etc., or Ubers, public transport, where you can pay $20 for a pill and go out and have a wonderful night. So cut a major cost. So we've sort of got that component of it as well. So how much would you have to increase the price of, say, ecstasy to really undo its attraction as an alternative to, say, alcohol consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, there's a lot more thinking needs to go into this, and we sort of need to move away from, prohibition era thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying about legalisation, but prohibition era thinking around, we have to seize in order to stop the problem or shape the problem.
I suppose in some ways that approach is very much targeting the symptoms rather than the broader cause of the usage, which is its availability.
Yep. Well, that's right. And I mean, the real aim here is, if we look at the national drug strategy in Australia, it's about reducing harm.
Mm.
So it doesn't, it doesn't serve any individuals nor the community good to see large numbers of people in prison, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that doesn't. It's not a good result for society and not a reduction of harm, on its own. So these are sort of, I think we need to go back to the intent, because I think that if you're talking in a purely sort of masters of business administration, public policy perspective and governance perspective, the KPI of seizing drugs doesn't match up to the policy intent of harm reduction.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, is keeping it focused on that outcome. I suppose looking at Australia as a case, we are obviously looking to stop supply chains that are coming from overseas. Are there any international best practice examples of how other countries have coped with stemming that price management, that availability on the streets without it simply being a seizures approach?
Look, I think, believe it or not, like I said, Thailand would be a very good example of that. I think also there's lots of bad examples from which we can, when we're always looking for best practice, which is a good idea. But the other side is also to look at the mistakes that others have made and to see how and what impact that has on our own policy decisions. Nothing works better than an autopsy of an absolute failure. We've seen it, and depending on your perspective too, we've seen a long-term investment by the US government in South America, which led to a destabilisation of the market within South America for the production of cocaine, for example. So instead of having 2 or 3 major syndicates running drugs or running the cocaine or global supply of cocaine, now we see that we've got any number of depending on how you count it, you could say that we have up to 20 or 30 different syndicates that are managing that global supply. So I think we can learn from that that sort of response may not necessarily work.
That's right.
We can learn from the responses of how aerial spraying affects farmers who don't have alternative crop sources. So if you're a poor farmer and you're trying to, in places like South America or Afghanistan, even in Laos and Myanmar, you're trying to feed your family and someone flies over your property spraying defoliants to kill cocoa plant or opium poppy. Whilst that has a great effect elsewhere, that's not a good impact for those people, and neither is it going to discourage them to produce those sorts of crops. So instead, it's going to encourage them to find innovative ways.
So it comes back to that overall harm concept,
Yep.
and that being the metric we measure it by. So obviously we've got a big serious international problem, and one that's affecting Australia greatly. And I guess if we had one last takeaway piece of advice for Australian law enforcement on this issue, what would that be?
Look, I think the real issue here is to release some of the pressure on law enforcement agencies around performance measures. There's this, at the end of each financial year, there's this lovely feeling that, if a police agency, a border agency goes and says, we've seized 20% more drugs this year, government's happy. If they turn around and say, we've actually seized less drugs this year, but we've had a better effect, despite that, there's going to be a lot of pressure within things, say, Senate estimates about, why didn't you seize more drugs? And I think that's the measure here, or the one takeaway, is that we need to release the pressure around seize more drugs. It's not having necessarily the impact that we think it's having.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this will be a great challenge for Australian law enforcement in 2017, is to come up with more innovative ways to manage, to measure their impact on the streets. So
and to target more widely, I guess, is the other thing.
More broadly as well. Okay, well, that's a lot for them to go away and think about. So thank you, John, for your time.